welcome to another episode of Legacy's Allure, brought to you by MTG Training Grounds, the educational series dedicated to providing you with all the info on popular decks, strategies, insight, and more for the Legacy format. I am your host, Zachary Cuck. Today, we have a guest I hope you've all had the pleasure of watching plenty of times before. Although he hasn't gotten to play in as many of the top-tier Magic events in the last few years, he had a pretty good excuse, and his career as a professional Magic player and commentator is no less impressive. To his name, he has 3 Star City Game Open top 8s, one of which resulted in a win. He has 1 Star City Game Invitational top 8. He has a multitude of Grand Prix top 32s, 4 of which he made the top 8. His best finish was a 3rd place at Grand Prix Charlotte in 2013. He was a Star City Games Select author and Star City Game Live commentator for years, and occasionally he still writes for Star City Games Premium. You can continue to keep up with all of his opinions on Magic, basketball, and more by following him on Twitter at @BasicMountain. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming today's guest, Patrick Sullivan. Patrick, welcome to Legacy's Allure.
Thanks for having me, Zach.
All right.
Also, a special guest here is my cat, Levi, who might periodically pop up on the screen. He's very needy, so hopefully it doesn't jar you too much, but he's doing all right for now.
They are welcome guests. Mine is somewhere around here. She may show up, but
okay. So,
you are known to be a fan, if not an expert, on the burn archetype, and I know you have very strong opinions on the deck. So I wanted you to enlighten all of us on the archetype and the deck. So why don't you, to kick things off, why don't you tell us what is burn? And I mean more in a philosophical sense. What is the deck? How does it work? And where did it come from?
So I kind of think of Legacy as being like triangulated in terms of what the decks are up to in a broad sense. You have all the really unfair stuff, the decks that are trying to kill on the first or second turn or lock someone out, or interact with zones that are hard to interact with. So Reanimator, Dredge, Storm, Belcher, and then there's sort of subsets of those decks. You know, Elves is kind of a normal deck and also kind of an unfair deck depending on the matchups. So that's one of the 3 triangles. And then there's other decks that are trying to fight the unfair stuff. So your Force of Will, Thoughtseize, Delver of Secret strategies kind of fall into this camp, and some of the other more disruptive decks that are trying to fight all the combo decks with a quick clock backed up by some counter spells. And then the third part of that triangle are the decks that are trying to prey on the Force of Will, Thoughtseize style decks. Decks that aren't really leaning on one particular card and maybe challenging for the Force of Will decks to interact with in other ways. So Maverick's kind of in that camp too. You don't really have one key card, so you don't care that much about Force of Will. You have a lot of redundancy in your threats. Those decks aren't necessarily good against the busted things, but they're pretty good, generally speaking, against the Force of Will, Thoughtseize style decks. Burn is also in that camp, although it's obviously a lot different than Maverick. You're playing a strategy where if one spell gets countered, you're usually not beat outright by that, but you're still playing with a bunch of spells that are challenging to interact with. So a lot of the decks that are trying to fight the unfair stuff aren't that good against fighting you because you're kind of off doing your own thing that they don't interact with very well, and one Force of Will doesn't beat you. And you also have a little bit of game against some of the unfair decks because Grim Lavamancer is randomly problematic for certain combo decks like Elves. Eidolon the Great Revel can be challenging for decks like Storm. So you're mostly about trying to fight the honest Force of Will decks, but a couple of your cards can give you some game against the busted decks as well.
All right, so you hit on a few of the important, like sort of the linchpin, like Eidolon the Great Revel is a great example of that. It's become almost unanimous in all burn lists, and it's probably one of the best cards that's been printed for the deck in the last couple years. But let's hit on what are the key spells and the most important pieces in the burn deck.
So the big thing for me is the critical mass of 1 mana, 3 damage spells. You get Lightning Bolt, Lava Spike, which you know from Modern. Then you have Chain Lightning, which is unique to Legacy. And Rift Bolt you can kind of lump into that camp as well. So you have a lot of built-in redundancy and pretty efficient effects for dealing damage. Fire Blast is something that it's just a huge jump in power level for that deck compared to the Modern or standard analogs. Especially in Legacy where the games can be over very fast, being able to cast 4 damage for free is a fantastic rate, and the cost doesn't matter if you're killing someone that turn.
Right.
So that's a huge shot in the arm for that style of deck. And for the format is also saturated with decks that are very heavy on non-basic lands. So Price of Progress is not great in every matchup, but some of, especially the 3-color, mid-range or Delver strategies, Price of Progress is your best card in that matchup, and is often a card that would take an otherwise bad matchup and make it very positive. So to me, those are the critical things. The creatures, you're playing probably with Goblin Guide and Eidolon the Great Rebel for sure. Then maybe you have Grim Lavamancer, or maybe you have Monastery Swift Spear. Or there's other kind of creatures competing for those last few slots. For me, Eidolon and Goblin Guide are in terms of raw power, just the best thing that you can do. And then the last creature slot, even if you want it, which sometimes I don't always want more than 8, is more of a metagame thing. Swift Spear is very good for increasing how fast the deck kills. Lavamancer is very good in the matches where you're trying to interact with creatures. So.
Okay, now this will sound like a dumb question, but just to hit on all the topics, how does Burn win?
Getting someone from 20 to 0 as fast as possible with cheap creatures that have haste or have some other non-combat way of dealing damage. So Grim Lavamancer and Eidolon fall into that camp, backed up by efficient burn spells.
Okay, so I've heard Burn described similarly to kind of how Storm is, where they say it's a critical mass deck, where it's not really the specific pieces that you have, it's just that you have enough of them to get to that point. And like you alluded to, the vast majority of the spells in the Burn deck are 1 red mana, or sometimes they cost even less, like you said with Fire Blast, and they deal at least 3 damage. That's sort of the bar that all of the spells have to achieve in order to be good enough. And you see that even with the creatures, right? Like Goblin Guide probably wouldn't see play in the deck if it didn't consistently deal more than 2 damage.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, for sure.
All right. So, what? Obviously, the creatures can vary, but are there variants of Burn? Like, what different versions are there? How do they differ? And why would you choose one version over the other?
Well, I definitely had my list fluctuate over the years, and different cards hop in and out. It's a lot of the same core. But for me, the tipping point is how much do you want to interact with creatures? Because you have Grim Lavamancer and Searing Blaze, both of which are awesome cards at helping out in the creature matchups, but are pretty poor in the combo matchups or matchups where your opponent just isn't playing a lot of creatures. The other side of that is, you have cards like Flame Rift, which are not very good if your opponent's playing with Tarmogoyfs and kind of attacking you back and making the game a damage race. But if your opponent's not up to that sort of thing, Flame Rift's a great rate. Assuming that you don't care about your life total, it's 2 deal 4 damage, which is above the bar that you alluded to before. So for me, the tipping points are how aggressive is the metagame and how much do I care about interacting with creatures. If I feel like I don't really need to interact with creatures, I'm more inclined to have things like Swift Spear and Flame Rift in the deck to make the deck go as fast as possible. If I feel like I need to interact with opposing creatures, then Lavamancer and Searing Blaze in the main deck become more attractive.
Okay, so really, it sounds like the key difference or the reason you would choose at least some of the creatures within the deck, or like you said with Searing Blaze, the spells, is whether you want to deal with creatures and be able to interact sort of with your opponent's game plan, or whether you're just trying to maximize velocity and just end the game as soon as possible. Now, obviously, you're trying to end. It's a deck that wants to end the game as soon as possible, no matter what. But like you mentioned, some of the creatures become deterrents from that. So like I can't think of a good one offhand, but there's always I guess like Thalia or those kind of creatures that like typically play defense more often than offense that you have to have an easy way of dealing with.
Yeah, or you are trying to play such a non-interactive game that you're just ignoring the battlefield altogether. Thalia is still problematic in those kind of spots. But if you're not trying to attack past a 2-power first striker, you can kind of just try to play the game through it. So there's different ways of sort of philosophically framing the deck. And then depending on the sideboard cards that you want for particular metagames, which I'm sure we're going to get into later, that informs some of the creature selection as well.
Okay. So, yeah, and we will touch on the sideboard tech and all that in a minute. But first I want to know, you obviously like Burn, and you've played it a bunch. I've seen the stats. Why do you like Burn so much? What makes the deck appeal to you?
So I went to Grand Prix Columbus in 2011 or something along those lines, back when Legacy was still pretty fresh in terms of it was definitely growing in popularity, but there wasn't the SCG Tour to the same extent. The format hadn't really been solved. So it was kind of like the Wild West of Legacy. And playing in that tournament was really attractive to me, and I was just trying to brew up some decks. And I was looking at it, I was like, oh, there's a lot of really good lightning bolts here, and playing with Fire Blast will be fun for me for nostalgic reasons. And this was right after, I can't remember the set, but Kiln Fiend had just gotten printed. And I was like, okay, this is like a pretty sweet addition for like a Storm-style damage-based deck. Mm-hmm. So I went to Columbus and played the deck without playing a game, just wrote up a 75-card list, and top 32'd that Grand Prix, and just had a ton of fun playing the deck and just playing the format in general. So after that, I mostly played the deck through the SCG Opens and the Invitationals I was playing in. I occasionally played a few other decks, but every time I played a different deck in Legacy, the experience has been horrible. Like I played Jund at an Invitational, and I played Jeskai Stoneblade after Owen won the Grand Prix with it a few years back, and I just spent the tournaments getting crapped on by awful decks. And it's like, all right, well, I think Legacy really rewards playing your deck very well rather than having the best deck for a given metagame because the games are just too hard. So, Levi's saying hi. So I just, at a certain point, I was like, I'm either going to invest a lot of energy to learning how to play a bunch of decks really well, or I'm just going to show up with this when I show up to Legacy tournaments. And I decided mostly just to do the second thing.
Right. And that's actually a really common recurring theme. My viewers might be getting tired of hearing me say it, but I'll say it again until everyone remembers. Legacy rewards familiarity.
Yes.
Having the best deck in the room, that statement, there's a chance that statement is totally nonsensical. Like there may not actually be a best deck in the room when it comes to Legacy, because there can easily be like 30 different archetypes, and you have no way of predicting what you're going to run into. That trying to pick the best deck or what you think will perform the best and not being really good at it is probably just a mistake. Just get familiar with what you like and what you're strong at, and stick with it, because that's what produces results. And
yeah, I mean, mathematically. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, it doesn't have to be what everyone else thinks is good. Go ahead.
Right. Mathematically, there has to be a best deck for a given tournament, but that's divorced from your playability, and that doesn't happen in the real world. Like how well you play the deck influences how good of a choice it is. And in Legacy, like there's just so little margin for error. The games can be over so fast, and the decks are so powerful that one mistake just dooms you. So even though there are some matchups that are really bad for Burn, and it's not like I've performed well in every single tournament, I think in terms of maximizing my own expected value in tournaments, it's a better choice for me than anything else I could pick up. And the times I've dipped my toes in the water playing other decks and not playing them that well has confirmed that I should be sticking to what I know.
Right. So let's say you could pick a metagame to play Burn in. What would you want to be there? What is Burn really good against, and what are its strong points?
I feel like the deck is very well positioned against creature decks that are not particularly fast and are kind of like the force of will, disruption, plus a little bit of a clock deck. So I think most builds of Delver of Secret strategies, if they don't have Tarmogoyf, are very favorable matchup. Decks like Death and Taxes and Maverick, I think, are typically very strong matchups as well. And then you have some cards in your deck that can make things very problematic for your opponent, regardless of whatever else is going on. Usually that's cards like Grim Lavamancer or Price of Progress or Eidolon of the Great Rebel. There's just some decks in Legacy that really struggle to effectively fight those cards. So your matchup can be good against those style of decks, again, almost independent of other things that are going on in the mashup.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've always felt like one of the decks I play Infect and hate to get paired against is like the Shardless Sultai decks, because they just seem to have a perfect combination of answers and counterspells to everything I want to do, but then I watch them struggle against a burn deck, especially one that's packing Price of Progress, because they want to get upwards of 4 or 5 lands, and none of them are basics usually. So they just they look horrible when they're playing against it, and I think, geez, I wish they feared me like that.
Yeah, well, I mean, the big difference, one of the big differences is just like you just care a lot about their individual cards more than a burn player does. Like Baleful Strix is not pleasant to play against if you're playing Infect. Kind of nonsense if you're playing burn. Some of your draws it matters, but often it doesn't. And if you're playing with Searing Blaze, sometimes you just don't care what they cast as long as it's something. Even something like Deathrite Shaman being a 1/2 can be a little obnoxious for Infect to play against sometimes. That doesn't really matter against burn. So a lot of their cards that they're playing to defend themselves against decks that are attacking with creatures don't really line up the right way against burn, and that's not unique to Charlotte Sultai either. Maverick is in a very similar space. Death and Taxes too. Those decks are very good at blocking. They're really good at getting a big numbers on the battlefield, lots of keywords that can make attacking prohibitive. But if you're just casting spells, ignoring combat for the most part, a lot of their tools just don't line up the right way.
Yeah, and I imagine in the case of, especially of Shardless and Death and Taxes, there's depending on your build, like say you're running a lot of Searing Blazes, the creatures in a lot of cases will just become more of a liability. If you play one of the little guys like Deathrite Shaman, that's just asking to get blazed. Whereas if you had something like if you waited a turn and just played Tarmogoyf instead, you might actually be able to avoid some of the problems, inherent with playing a little creature like that. But in any event, it seems obvious here that the good matchups are like you said, the slower creature-based, not really fast aggro, but just moderately paced, like more mid-rangey style decks.
Yeah, the decks you would point to is trying to fight the combo decks. Those are usually going to be your good matchups.
Okay, so that's going to lead into the next question, although it seems a little obvious now. What would be the bad metagame? What are the decks you do not want to play against, and what is Burn's, sort of glaring weaknesses?
Combo decks that are either so fast that your defensive measures don't work, or they don't care about your defensive measures. By defensive measures, I mean the cards you play against them that are challenging. Usually it's Eidolon, sometimes it's some sideboard cards. Before Eidolon got printed, your matchup against Storm was a disaster. It's still definitely south of 50%, but if you are on the play, if you win the roll and you have Eidolon on the play, I think you're above 50% to win the matchup. So you can still beat some of their draws now with Eidolon, but that matchup's still really bad. The really bad ones are like Show and Tell based decks, Reanimator, combo decks that are about slapping two spells together. They can usually do it pretty fast. You can't interact with their combo, and they need to cast so few spells to go off that things like Eidolon don't really trip them up. So those matchups, Sneak and Show, Reanimator especially, decks like that are very challenging matchups.
Yeah, it sounds like Grizzlebrand specifically is the major problem there.
It's all major problems. You're slower than they are by a full turn. They have Force of Will to stop your turn 3 kills. You don't have anything to stop their kills, and they kill faster than you do. So those combo decks are definitely the worst matchups.
Okay. So let's say we're playing something like Shardless Sultai or a Delver-based deck. What should I bring to the sideboard if I think burn is going to be a heavy part of my meta and I really want to shore up my defenses? What are good sideboard options against burn?
So, I mean, it's a matter of degrees. Like, if you want to go and become super hateful to beat burn specifically, there are some cards out there that burn just really can't beat. Leyline of Sanctity is the top of the list. There's some other cards that are, as well, Chalice of the Void, that are very challenging for a lot of burn builds to beat. But those cards are fairly narrow. They don't come in against a ton of opponents, and it may not be worth the sideboard slots. Mm-hmm. The cheap blue counters that interact with spells are the best sideboard cards that you're likely to bring in other places. No, those cards specifically don't interact well with Shardless Agent, so maybe it's a bad example for Shardless Sultai. Right. Flusterstorm is excellent. Duress, Inquisition of Kozilek. Discard spells that don't cost life payment like Thoughtseize does. Right. Things that cost 1 mana and realistically trade with a spell are very powerful. Blue Elemental Blast and Hydroblast are awesome too. So burn is, it's a critical mass deck. Often if just 1 or 2 spells get countered, if you're applying pressure with Tarmogoyfs or doing something to lock the game up, that's going to be enough to win the game. So any 1 mana spell that regularly interacts with a burn deck is going to be very good for you.
Okay. So now this is a legacy themed webcast, but I want to touch real quick on the modern burn deck, because it seems like, well, first of all, for anyone who doesn't know, Burn is a much more popular deck in Modern, and many would argue it's a, I won't say a better deck. It's a more powerful deck where it attacks the popular decks in the format a little better, just because of the inherent life loss with the mana bases in Modern.
That's part of it. It's also just a raw power level issue. Like,
Sure.
there's a lot of really powerful cards in Legacy that people play. They're a lot more powerful than Chain Lightning or whatever. In Modern, the best decks aren't playing cards that are appreciably more powerful than Lava Spike and Rift Bolt and Lightning Bolt. So that also helps a lot with the Modern deck. It's just more in line with what's going on in the format.
Right. The Burn decks in Modern, they're approaching the format, like you said, with an equal power level, and the inherent life loss of the other decks means that people come much more prepped for Burn. Like they're ready for that to be one or more of their matchups, depending on the size of the event. So it's really common to see like dedicated sideboard hate for it. So life gain is really common. And as a result, then in Modern, a lot of times Burn players are bringing things like Skullcrack, or more commonly now is Tarkus Command, for the same effect, where you can prevent opponents from gaining life because that's effectively countering their life gain spells. Now, you don't see so much of that in the Legacy variants. Now, they'll play cards like Sulfuric Vortex, and actually I'm skipping ahead here. This is for you to describe, but all of this is to say there are sideboard options to fight what people might bring in against you, and that's common in Modern, but it may not be quite as common in Legacy. But we'll discuss it anyway. What are the next level sideboard cards? Like, what is Burn bringing in to fight what you expect your opponents to bring in to try and stop you?
Well, Sulfuric Vortex is your best way to fight Umezawa's Jitte and Batterskull, which are two of the more common cards that beat you. And it's especially nice because it's a recurring way to shut it down, as opposed to the Skullcrack style options where, okay, you stop Batterskull for one turn. If you're not killing them the next turn, you're just in the same spot. So Vortex shutting down everything forever, as long as it stays in play, is really good. It's also just a powerful card in long games. If you resolve it against Miracles, well, it takes them a million turns to kill you, so it's very hard for them to beat you in time before Vortex kills them. I think the most next level thing I ever did in the sideboard at Grand Prix Denver, when this was 2012 or 2013, Jund was very popular, and there was a lot of Hymn to Torak, Liliana of the Veil decks floating around. I had Guerrilla Tactics in my sideboard, which I actually got someone in with on camera the last round of day one. So, you are susceptible to discard spells, and Hymn to Torak is one of the best in terms of not specifically an anti-burn card, but just a card that people play. Hymn to Torak might be the best one in Legacy if you're trying to get an edge in the burn matchup. Again, it's a critical mass deck. You don't care what you hit as long as you're hitting something. So Guerrilla Tactics is a pretty next level way of fighting those kind of cards.
Yeah, I think the next, like, I don't even know if you want to call it next level, because you're definitely sideboarding it for a specific reason other than what your opponents might bring in against you. But cards like Smash to Smithereens and what's the more common one? Destructive Revelry. Those I could see utilizing as sort of a next level methodology, where like you expect them to, they're probably going to bring in like Leyline of Sanctity if they're a deck like Sneak and Show that's already potentially has that as an answer to like Hand Disruption. They might bring it in against you anyway, type thing. But otherwise, yeah, I think in general I agree. It seems like your deck is super streamlined and people don't have dedicated hate, so you don't need dedicated anti-hate.
Yeah, if you're sticking to the mono red build, and I prefer being mono red to splashing a color, just because I think every time I've dipped into a second color, the losses I've picked up to Wasteland have not been worth whatever I was getting out of the second color. Because Burn does kind of need to hit its land drops. And in the matchups where they have Dazed and Spell Pierce plus Wasteland, if your lands are getting hit, then more of your spells are getting Dazed and Spell Pierce, and the whole thing collapses. Yep. So I like staying monocolor, but that does limit your sideboard options because you don't have, sometimes I've wanted green for Destructive Revelry. Sometimes I've considered white for Boros Charm and Chain of the Rocks. Like, there's attractive cards out there in some other colors. I prefer sticking to mono red, but that limits your ability to interact with opposing cards. Fortunately, not that many people have, Chills or even Leyline of Sanctity, these really problematic cards. But you do catch some random losses, especially to enchantments, because you're just not set up to interact with them very easily.
And actually, that's sort of a thought or a thing I've encountered with some of the interviews I've done here with the decks that aren't. I hate to use tier 1 and tier 2 to describe legacy decks because it's so. The player's skill is so much more important than like the tier of the deck, and like powerful is so case specific. Like your strategy can be incredibly powerful against one thing, and then it does virtually nothing. Like you described earlier, like when Burn plays Reanimator, sometimes it's just a joke. Like it doesn't matter how powerful Lightning Bolt is in a vacuum. Like turn 1 Griselbrand doesn't care, but we don't care about cards. We care about decks. That's ultimately what we're. You know what I mean? So yeah, context is everything in describing power level. Anyway, one thing I think that can give Burn a huge edge in Legacy is the fact that that we're not playing Modern. Like people do not specifically try and sideboard to beat it, or even a lot of times don't even try and have like main board accommodations. Like if they have them, it's purely circumstance. Like Deathrite Shaman gains life, but that's not why they're playing Deathrite Shaman, right?
Exactly. It's very rare that I've run into an opponent in a tournament who had a sideboard card for me specifically. Like, you do lose games to some sideboard cards, like Leyline and like Chill and some other ones that I've mentioned, but it's very rare that the person's like, I was gunning for Burn, and that's why I have this card. It's, I have Leyline because I'm trying to be discard spells for my combo deck, happens to be excellent against you, but that's not really the reason why it's here.
Yeah, I think one of the only decks I've ever seen really put any effort into it is Death and Taxes, and I think that's probably just because their matchup is so incredibly bad that they'll run like their 1 or 2 Enlightened Tutors along with a Cop Red, and that's their whole game plan is like, I will beat Burn by this scrubby tactic, but I can't win otherwise. So, and especially
I've seen Core Firewalkers in people's sideboards too, is another way for their matchup is not good there, and if they get a little bit of time, they can assemble Stoneforge Mystic plus any piece of equipment to win the game. So as long as they have some tool to slow the game down a little bit, they can turn the matchup from bad into positive, in my mind.
Yeah, and I would think it's really... I hate to say it's metagame specific after we talked about how metagames are super hard to predict in Legacy, but as a general rule of thumb for anybody watching, the size of the event can sometimes be an indicator of whether you think Burn or decks like Burn is going to be a real problem. Like much smaller events, especially ones hosted like at your local game store, are far more likely to have Burn show up and perform well than at really big events, especially after like round 3 or 4 of a Grand Prix or something like that. You're just more likely to run into it, and it's worth considering then. But I think in general that otherwise you would maybe not. Not that should dissuade you from playing it at such an event if you're good at it, but you just as a player for another deck, you wouldn't normally put that much effort into fighting it.
So I think that Burn definitely gets played, especially at the local level and so forth, more than it should, like more than its place in the metagame and its power level would suggest. But most people who play Burn, to be frank, are not very skilled. Often they're doing it for budget reasons or because they don't really want to be sitting there with ponders and brainstorms contemplating all these different decision trees. So lower skill players do gravitate towards it. And if your ability level is not that high, like having some spell pierces and dazes and flusterstorms is going to be good enough to beat most Burn pilots if they're not very good. If you're playing against skilled Burn pilots, maybe that's enough, maybe it's not, depending on other variables that are going on. So I would say that if you think you're going to see a lot of lower skilled players at kind of the local level playing the deck, I wouldn't dedicate that much room to it, but I would probably have more Flusterstorm, Spell Pierce, Hydroblast style cards than maybe you otherwise would. You can shore up the matchup without needing to have Haymakers, because most Burn pilots are just not good enough to beat the soft counters.
Okay. So let's say you are a pretty solid player, but maybe you're not a legacy player, for cost, or you just haven't been playing for very long, or whatever reason. Why would you recommend someone pick up Burn? Like, what type of player do you recommend it to? And when you're trying to rationalize why you should argue for that over something else, what are you going to say to them? Why should they play Burn?
I mean, if you're skilled with playing aggressive decks in other formats, a lot of those skills translate over. It's also something that's very nice about Legacy. You know, when you're playing Burn, is a lot of the formats you're playing against effectively hard counters, and your Burn spells are not that strong. So in Modern's a good example where you're playing against mana leaks and cryptic commands and so forth. Mana leak, you know, you rarely have 3 mana lying around, and then a lot of the other counters that get played are essentially hard counters. You know, there's spell snares in people's sideboards and so forth. In Legacy, people lean a lot more on soft counters. It's a lot more about dazes and spell pierces and those kind of cards than it is about having hard counters. Outside of Force of Will, not a whole lot of hard counters get played. So if you can get skilled at how do I manage against spell pierce right now? How am I managing against daze? How am I managing against stifle? If you can get good at that particular skill, I think Burn gives you a lot of room to outmaneuver, you know, the blue mid-range decks of the format. And those decks are what makes up the majority of Legacy tournaments. Mm-hmm. Like Daze, Brainstorm, Ponder, backed up by some sort of creature-based clock, is the foundation for a lot of Legacy decks. So if you can get good at playing those matchups, your win rate with the deck can be very high.
Yeah, and actually, while I think of it here, one other deck that is becoming really popular in Paper Magic anyway, or at least it was leading up to SCG Philly, is lands. And it seems to me that matchup, and you know, I've never played it because I've never played lands or Burn, but it looks to me like Burn has a really good matchup there. Like, and lands is one of those very polar decks where typically your matchup is really strong or incredibly terrible. There's very few decks that when they get paired up against lands, it's like a 50-50 game. And
right.
if it's going to be popular, or at least it was becoming more popular, then Burn becomes very attractive then, I think, as well.
Yeah, you are soft to their best draws, because if they're able to quickly establish Chasm plus Loam plus way to get multiple lands into play, you're kind of stuck. And if they have something like Zern Orb in the sideboard, that can also make it pretty bad sometimes too, although Sulfuric Vortex can trump that. But if they don't have their best draw, if they're sort of, you know, one of the slower Loam draws, or they don't open on exploration into a fast path to Merit Lage, you're a heavy favorite against them. And there's a lot of matchups that are like that. You cannot necessarily do anything about most decks' best draws, but if they don't have their best draw, they're in a lot of trouble. And Death and Taxes and Maverick are kind of in that camp too. The creature decks that have access to Stoneforge Mystic, like, yeah, you can get blown out of the water sometimes when they have their Vial into Disruptive Creature into Stoneforge draw. But if they don't have that, they're in a ton of trouble. Lands is much of the same camp. You can't interact with their best stuff, but they need to have it. They're in a lot of trouble if they don't have it.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that if I was going to recommend Burn to someone, and not just because they're new, I think Burn is also a very good deck for newer players, both for cost reasons and for sort of ease of I won't say ease of playing, because you still have to be good at what you're doing to play it well, like you alluded to earlier with all the soft counters. But also, it's a deck that is fairly straightforward. Like, what you have to do is really obvious. There's no brainstorms to really to give you places to trip up. Like, you have less mistake potential, I guess. But it's also an incredibly consistent deck. Like, I think Burn. What is the average kill? About turn 3.5, unmolested?
I would say the deck probably kills on turn 4 more frequently than turn 3. Like, it probably kills more frequently on turn 3 than I think, because I'm playing a little bit slower to play around the soft counters. Full throttle, I think 3.5 is probably an apt descriptor. But in reality, the pacing's a little bit slower in a lot of your matchups because you're playing around Dazes and Pierces and so forth.
Yeah, and there's just a lot of unknowns. You know, it's one of those risk versus reward type things where, like, a lot of players won't jam a combo, or in this case, you won't jam that last Fire Blast with no mana up because you just don't want to get destroyed by a Daze when you could easily wait till the next turn and you know, be sure of it type thing.
Yeah, there's a lot of risk reward calculations, and things can change on the fly. Like, if you're playing against a Delver of Secret strategy, like trying to get Price of Progress to resolve is a pretty huge deal. But it's naturally bad against Daze because they can always pick up one land to mitigate some of the impact. And if they have a Wasteland up, then they can do a lot to mitigate Price of Progress. So
Right.
how I value Price of Progress in a game depends a lot on just like what are the lands that are in play. Even setting aside like cards in hand and how much mana up, just what particular lands are in play influences how much am I going to try to play around a Daze or a Pierce with this Price of Progress, or if I'm willing to just throw it out there because they have tools in play to mitigate it. So yeah, the information and how you're weighing different things and what you're playing around just changes on the fly, and it can be on very little information.
Okay, so quickly describe your perception of the skill barrier to burn, both the introduction to the deck and like sort of getting a grasp of how to play it versus the barrier to saying like, oh, that person is a master of the deck, like they really understand the intricacies of it.
Well, there's a lot of matchups where you just kind of go. The matchups that don't involve blue mana on the other side of the table, pretty much you just do your thing. And there's some macro level things you're playing around. You know, your opponent has a green fetch land up. You should always have on your mind what are the implications of fetching Dryad Armor, untap Umezawa's Jitte equipped. Like once they have enough mana for that. Maybe Umezawa's Jitte or Dryad Arbor aren't even in your opponent's deck, but it always needs to be on your radar as something to add to the calculus. And even in the blue matchups, it's like, okay, what about Vendilion Click, untap Umezawa's Jitte? What if they have Vendilion Click and they can take my one instant, untap, and Umezawa's Jitte me? What are the lines of play there? These things don't come up in every single game, obviously, even if those cards are in your opponent's deck, but you need to have that on your radar at all times. So learning the intricacies of playing the blue matchups, especially the soft counter spells, and then that's the big thing. And then after you get a hold of that, you start having more of the like instant speed creature into untap Umezawa's Jitte, attack me, sort of lines of play on the other side of the table. The nice thing about burn is there's not a ton of stuff you care about on the other side of the table. A lot of their creatures just don't really matter other than their ability to gain life or find an Umezawa's Jitte or allow them to Swords to Plowshare their knight to gain a bunch of life. Like, for the most part, you don't care about the small stuff that's going on in the game, but the big stuff matters a lot. So you just have to get used to having the big stuff on your radar.
Okay. Yeah, and that makes sense. I've played against burn plenty of times, and I feel like a lot of times we're doing the same thing against a really good burn player anyway. Again, this is from the perspective of playing Infect. We're doing the same thing where we're attempting to sort of overload one another, where like I'm trying to set it up where you've suspended a Rift Bolt and cast a Lava Spike, so you only have one mana left. So I in my mind you potentially have Lightning Bolt and Fire Blast, but that's it. After that I've got it. And you should be and I think most burn players, especially good ones, should be thinking the same thing. Like, I need to hold at least one mana to pay for the Daze, in addition to the Lightning Bolt I have to cast to play around a Daze. But also he might have Invigorate, so you got these. It becomes a chess match of who can wait the longest to blink type thing.
Yeah, for sure. But then like that's sort of on the macro level, the micro level rather. On the macro level is sort of like, as a burn player playing against Infect, I'm often like, I can't play the waiting game better than they do. They have cantrips to fix their draw, and they do a lot more for 0 and 1 mana than I can do for 0 and 1 mana. Like, my interaction is 1 to 2 mana, and their interaction is 0 to 1. So the waiting game and let's build up a big stack and see who comes out on top, I think is typically very favorable for the Infect player. So that's a matchup where I'm much more focused on, like, let's just try to kill on turn 3 and push this as hard as possible. If they tap out, maybe I'll try to kill a creature, but I'm not going to try to kill a creature when they have mana up because that kind of game just doesn't favor me.
Right.
So you had to have some knowledge of, like, what are the types of battles that I can win? It's easier to sit there with a Lightning Bolt and a Searing Blaze in your hand and say, I've got them covered, but Infect can often play over the top of that, especially if you're giving them a lot of time to sculpt their hand and set things up. So you have to be paying attention to what's on the battlefield, obviously, but you also have to understand your positioning in the matchups and say, even though it looks like I can interact here effectively, in the long term, I'm going to probably lose this battle more often than not, and I should focus on trying to get the game done as fast as possible.
Yeah, actually, the sort of the situation I described might be more better personified in the Miracles matchup. And I know I've seen good video coverage of that. I know where you watch a good burn player sort of set up to take advantage of the tight mana sometimes that Miracles can get themselves into, especially when they're trying to manage a counterbalance, whether they have Sensei's Divining Top or not. But that's something definitely worth learning, I think, and a very high skill barrier to getting really good with burn is fighting against a counterbalance and how to sequence spells and that kind of thing.
Yo, that's where you get to see it. I mean, when you see a burn player that's under counterbalance lock, you get to see how good they are, because often the game doesn't end for a long time. There's an opportunity for the burn player to build up a hand to try to finagle their way into a couple points of damage, and the players who are not good never get out of that. Even if you are good, you still lose a reasonable percentage of the time. Like if they have a top and they're floating a 1 and a 2 on the top, it's going to be hard even if you play really, really well. But there are a lot of games that are in the middle of those two things, and that's where you get to see skilled burn players do their thing.
Awesome. So I would say that you were a good, very skilled burn player. From what I've heard and talked to people, you knew your stuff. So why don't you tell us about one of your favorite times when you were playing burn? Sort of describe the scenario, what happened, what you did, the outcome, and why was it cool?
I don't know. I've played so many matches; they have all blurred together. I mean, the most I guess the most famous one is probably the match against Ross. Miriam. We were playing in the top 8 of the Open in Los Angeles a long time ago. He was playing Maverick, and I was playing Burn, and I was in a pretty bad spot where I needed him basically to tap out. He had a Wasteland up and a variety of non-basics in play, and I needed to get him to tap out to sacrifice a Kasali Pride Mage to kill a Vortex. If he tapped out, then I had Price of Progress plus another spell to kill him over the top. And I couldn't kill him otherwise. In that game, if he can untap, if he just goes untap, take 2 off the Vortex, draw a card, attack you with all of my eligible attackers, I'm dead on the spot. I'm on 1, and I have my own Vortex in play. So that's just going to kill me on my upkeep, even if I survive combat somehow. But I was able to kind of sequence things and I guess throw him off the scent enough with the sequencing the spells and my body language to make it seem like the Vortex really mattered and he had to tap out and kill it. And I was able to pounce when he did that.
Yeah, and I think when I did the interview with Tom Ross, he basically described the same kind of scenario where sometimes the only winning line is to convince your, it's not blatant lying, it's bluffing or misleading, where like you have to get your opponent to believe something is more important than it really is, and you sort of play hard on that imperfect information. So
yeah. I mean, that's a big difference between Magic Online and physical Magic. Like in physical Magic, there's a person across from you, and if you're paying attention, there's all sorts of information to be accumulated. Watch people shuffle around the cards in their hand and then play a land out of their hand. A lot of people keep the lands and their spells kind of, here are my spells, here are my lands. And you see people move cards around, even that sort of stuff. If you're on top of it, there's a lot of information to be pulled without a word being said. And there's spots to gain an edge there if you're sensitive about it.
Yeah, I probably don't do enough of that myself. I think that's a skill that only being really comfortable with playing the game like at a base level before you can start really trying to get into the psyche of your opponent and just like you said, their body language and the things that sort of give you the next few percentage points beyond just technical play.
Yeah, I mean that's a big thing that Brad Nelson talks about. Well, I asked him once, like, what's your preparation for Constructed like? And he said something that's pretty fascinating. It's like he said, I want to know all the matchups well enough that the first 3 or 4 turns are on autopilot for me. I know exactly what I want to do in all matchups. Once you get beyond turn 4, turn 5, or whatever the turn is in whatever format, enough random stuff is going on that you sort of need to be reacting to what's going on. Mm-hmm. But if you can memorize the first 3 or 4 turns, your opponent is picking nothing off of your body language because you're just playing like this. And if you already know what you're going to be doing, you can focus your energy on watching your opponent and picking up all that information from their body language and so forth. Like Brad's got a super intimidating presence at the table, and he's very good at reading body language. And a lot of that is he does enough work leading up to the tournament where he doesn't have to think about things on the first couple of turns, and that can be the focus of all of his energy. I'm nowhere near that level, but it was really fascinating to hear Brad put it in like terms that precise. Like that is something he's actively trying to get out of his opponent in the first couple turns of a game.
Yeah, and I mean his results speak for themselves, so it must be working.
Right. Brad's a world-class player, and that's a big part of it.
Maybe I can talk him into giving me a lesson on here sometime, so that all of you out there can get the same lesson.
I've got some bad news about that lesson. It starts with play a lot more Magic than you play right now. That's what it's. I mean, maybe that's what you want to be doing or whatever. But Brad, like that's a lot of work to get to the point that he's at. Like being able to memorize and on rote go through the first 4 turns of a game in any matchup. Yeah. Like that's a lot of work. You don't just get to do that, you know.
On the plus side, Legacy is probably one of the formats that gives you the most opportunities to do that if you're not a pro Magic player, because the decks don't change much and your matchups are going to be, other than really big events, your matchups are going to be the same, 20 to 25 guys you play with every other week. So you might actually get to a point where those kind of things start to become second nature, just because you get to play the matchups for years on end instead of just for one rotation. Which,
I mean, that's the other side of that though, is like brainstorm, ponder, fetch lands. It's just really complicated.
That's true.
Like even if you played Magic for 10 or 15 years, and being on the other side of that, of like, okay, well they brainstormed and they didn't shuffle with their fetch land, so that means that their draw step is something they wanted to keep. So what's like? That stuff is too hard to memorize. For standard or modern, you can probably get to that point. But if you're playing with the cantrips and fetch lands, like I don't know how much you'd have to play to be able to like, yep, all right, brainstorm and put these 2 back and play this land, and I want to shuffle 2 turns from now. Go. I don't care what you're doing. It's like that seems really hard to get to that point.
Yeah, I think you'd have to rely on your instincts a lot, and I get scared when I have to rely on my instincts too much, because I'm just never confident that I've let them do the thinking. So
yeah, sure.
So let's topic hop for a second. You were a pretty major fixture on the SCG Tour coverage team for quite a while there, and you've watched probably hundreds or thousands of matches unfold from the commentator perspective. So do you have any special insight or thoughts on Magic, the game, the people, the lifestyle, from your experiences there?
So, I had a lot of experience playing in, Grand Prix and Pro Tours and the SEG events for a long time. So I'm not completely divorced, or it's not like I have no knowledge of what that kind of experience is like, but it is very cool to still see like teams and recurring cast of characters, playing together and rooting each other on, and, the camaraderie before and after events. Like that never gets old for me to watch. Mm-hmm. In terms of, what I've watched and how that can improve my Magic game and advice I have for other people, I guess, it's like people give away a ton of information at the table. I know we just talked about the body language stuff, mm-hmm. but when you're overhead and you're seeing people's hands and you see people's body language and you see the way that people tap their cards, like that information is all around you at all times. And if you can get to the point where you're perceptive about it, your ability to bluff, your ability to predict what cards are in your opponent's hand, all that stuff. Like when your opponent's thinking about a mulligan, if your opponent takes a long time to keep their hand and then decides to keep what is the texture of their hand most likely, like people give away so much information at the table that I always felt that way as a player, but as a commentator, it really solidified that belief. And I think if you want to get an edge in your game, that's a good place to start.
Yeah, and I for you and for the listeners, I didn't mean to imply that Patrick had been away from the game for too long. He definitely still plays and definitely still plays well. I just very few of us have ever gotten an opportunity to be a commentator, and I just wondered if there was any like very special thing that you had picked up after doing commentary on all these games that like you just notice it all the time now, and you don't notice anyone else picking up on it near as quickly or anything like that.
Just bluffing. Bluffing's the big one. I mean, and then that's when Tom Ross was killing it on with the SEG events and the Grand Prix and so forth. Mm-hmm. Like he just bluffed a ton. It wasn't like he was doing it all the time, but he picked his spots. And if you look at his success rate versus how many times he was called and had to put his creature in the graveyard or whatever he was up to, his hit rate was very good. And Brad, much the same deal. Todd Anderson, I think in that camp too. They play a bunch, and they are very conscious of their own body language, and they pounce if you give away information. Like, they are just on top of that so fast. And when you're watching overhead and you see both players' hands and everything that's going on, it really reinforces that as being like, this is the place where there's a lot of edge to be gained, and very few people are out there trying to get it.
Yeah, and I think it's this is just my thoughts, because I have an MTGO account, but I like never play on it, and I think your technical play can become very, very strong from playing on MTGO, but that's all that you can translate to paper Magic. Then you cannot learn bluffing hardly at all, and you certainly can't learn body language or any of the tells from playing on an online client, because you never see your opponent. So I doubt we'll ever be to the point, or at least I doubt I'll still be playing when we're to the point where nobody ever plays paper Magic and it's all online. So that is a skill that is can be developed and is worth developing for as long as you're going to be playing paper tournament Magics.
Definitely. I mean, it's the biggest gap between the two things, or the biggest differences. I mean, there's still room to bluff on Magic Online, but I think you're way less precise there, because it's more of a numbers calculation rather than I'm picking up on this person's body language or way they tap their cards or whatever. In paper Magic, like I said, that information is being spewed by everyone, even very good players, all the time. And not a lot of players make an effort to capitalize on it. Most good players that you see at events are playing good ABC Magic, by which, I mean, they know how to play their cards, they know the interactions, they know what matters in matchups. Not that many of them are trying to, like, shoot the bluffing information game gap. But the ones that are able to do it well are some of the best performers that on the SCG Tour and in Grand Prix and Pro Tours.
Yeah, that's really cool. So there are surprisingly few like really noteworthy and sort of exceptional commentators in Magic's history. I mean, there's been a few, and like Brian David Marshall and some of them that have been doing it for a really long time. But there's, for all the pro players, there are certainly not a huge number of pro commentators, or at least really big famous names. So being one of those few, how does the experience of being Patrick Sullivan, the commentator, rank in your history of the game and your experience with the game?
I try not to think too much about things like legacy, like other people get. So, like human being legacy, not legacy the format.
Right.
I know it's the podcast. Other people kind of make that story up for you after the fact. But I'm definitely prouder of this than my playing career. First of all, I think that I'm more successful at this than playing, so that's a good starting point. But I also, I like the feeling of, providing an experience for other people, doing work that matters. And like over the tour the last 2 years, it's a little different now because I've scaled back some. But I had people come up to me who are, who like, I have some security job at a hospital where I've got the graveyard shift, and it's like horrible, and I'm there by myself, and listening to the commentary, I would just plug it in and listen to last weekend's replay, and like it gets me through my shift. Or talk to people who were stationed in the military overseas, and like when you hear stories about that, like when you're touching people in that sort of way, I remember parts of my life where things were not going well for me, or I had challenges, and the things that I could grasp onto and enjoy meant a lot to me at that time. And hearing other people, say that about the work that I do means a ton. So I really appreciate that a lot. It's a big part of doing this. The hours can be challenging, and traveling all the time can be challenging, but that feeling of providing something that other people value, it's really sweet. And I definitely get more out of that than top 8ing a Grand Prix or trying to qualify for the Pro Tour again, or whatever else comes from playing.
Yeah, and to all the listeners and the viewers out there who are wondering, commentary is not easy to do. I I'm sure anybody who follows this stream regularly has seen some of the other videos on our YouTube channel where I am attempting to do commentary for a Legacy series I host here in Alabama, and it's probably miserable by comparison to what Patrick has done. But I will tell you firsthand, it is very difficult to do, and getting good at it is probably a skill that will take me as long as it did to get good at Magic. So when he says it means a lot, and it was an important part of his life, you better believe it, because it's worth working towards. Like, you have to get good at it. And it's something that should be appreciated. I certainly do. I think the commentary, or just the Magic coverage in general, has gone up tremendously in the last 3 years or so since you were so involved, and that the whole Star City team really put the effort into making it what it is.
I mean, there's a lot of people that, as Cedric and I naturally end up getting a lot of the limelight because we are public visible, we're the people on camera and all that. There's just so many people that go into making, the SCG broadcast and the Wizards broadcast what it is. It's not a one-person effort by any stretch. And a lot of different departments, a lot of different people have gotten better at their craft too. Our producers and our production staff with SCG, they're phenomenal at what they do. And they're as big a part as me or Cedric or any other SCG commentators at making the show what it is. And I'm sure if you ask any of the Wizards broadcast team, they would tell you the same thing. So it's a lot of people that go into making it what it is.
Patrick, before signing off here, is there any last thing you want to say to any of the listeners, be it Legacy, commentary, Magic in general?
Make sure you know what you're trying to get out of this thing. That's my biggest bit of advice for any aspiring Magic player, especially someone who's thinking about taking it competitively. Very few people get to do it for a living, and very few people even get to be profitable doing it. I mean, I had more tournament success than most that will pick up a Magic card, and I'm definitely down money if you just look at it of cards and travel cost and tournament entry fee against what I've won as a player. But if you want something that's challenging and engaging and gives you an opportunity to travel around, make lifelong friendships, have a couch to crash at no matter what city in the country you're in, like all that kind of stuff, Magic is just awesome. So if you're doing it because you see some sort of prize check and you want that to be you, I mean, that's good. But hopefully you're getting other stuff out of it as well.
I agree completely. Made more friends doing this than I will ever win dollars probably in prizes. So.
Oh, easily. Yeah, I'm in the exact same spot, but I wouldn't trade the experiences that I've had for anything. So just make sure you know what you're getting out of it, because you're not going to get rich doing this, but it can be a really rewarding part of your life.
All right. Well, Patrick, it has been a blast doing this episode with you. I feel especially lucky for being granted your audience. I certainly hope.
Anytime.
Yeah, no problem. I hope we continue seeing you in the future in the Magic scene. And thanks for taking the time to join us.
I'll be doing the SCG Open in Indianapolis next weekend. Cedric and I will be doing the commentary. So if you want to check it out, go ahead. And if not, there'll be other shows.
Well, I will bust it to try and get this posted by then so that everyone knows, although I'm sure they already know. But in any event, thanks for joining us. And thank you to all of our listeners and viewers. It has been my pleasure to bring you this episode of Legacies of Allure. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and feel free to leave us feedback on our YouTube page, or you can message me directly at mtgtraininggrounds@gmail.com. Like us on Facebook at the user mtgtraininggrounds, and follow us on Twitter at mtg_trgrounds. I'm Zachary Cuck. Thank you for joining us.